Please, sir. Buy my drawing. I'm very hungry. Billionaire Alexander Carter, feared by rivals, envied by peers, never imagined that a single moment, a single encounter, could unravel everything he believed about himself. But when a frail, ragged boy handed him a drawing, something inside him stirred, something he had buried for decades. At first, it seemed like just a child's sketch, but as he stared at the crude yet eerily familiar details, a chill ran down his spine. It was his mansion. The same towering walls, the sprawling gardens, the grand fountain in the courtyard. Every piece of his secluded world, drawn by a boy who should have no way of knowing it existed. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. In front of the mansion stood two figures. One, a tall man in a suit. And beside him, a small child clutching his hand. Alexander felt his breath hitch, his fingers trembling against the edges of the paper. The man in the drawing was him. But the boy, who was he? How did this child, this stranger, capture something so intimate, so personal? A forgotten memory whispered in the back of his mind, clawing to the surface. And that's when Alexander knew. This wasn't just about a beggar boy. This was about a past he had desperately tried to forget, and a truth he wasn't ready to face. A past that refuses to stay buried. The drawing haunted him. No matter how much Alexander tried to ignore it, the image stayed etched in his mind. At night, as he sat in his massive, empty mansion, the silence pressed in on him. The air felt heavier. The shadows seemed longer. And the past was stirring. He hadn't thought about his childhood in years, had forced himself to forget. But now, memories flooded back like an unstoppable tide. Once upon a time, he had been a hungry child, raised in a struggling home, abandoned by a father who drowned his grief in alcohol. Alexander had fought for everything he had. He had clawed his way out of poverty, building his empire from the ground up. Power, control, wealth, these were his weapons, his armor. And yet, as he stared at the child's drawing, all of that seemed meaningless. For the first time in decades, Alexander felt something foreign gnawing at his chest. Not just pity, not just sympathy, something more. He had to find that boy again. The search for answers. Days passed, then weeks. Alexander's business suffered. His empire, built on cold calculations and ruthless precision, began to crack. He missed meetings. He lost deals. His mind was consumed, not by profits and power, but by a pair of haunting eyes and a crumpled drawing. He scoured the streets, but the boy had vanished. He searched every alley, questioned every vendor, but no one had seen him. The city was vast, and the poor were invisible, just another face in the crowd. Then, one evening, as he stepped out of his office, he saw him, standing in the same place, on the same street corner. Alexander's heart pounded. Without hesitation, he strode over, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "You!" His voice was firm, but his hands were shaking. "I need to talk to you." The boy blinked, surprised but not afraid. "Is something wrong, sir?" Alexander took a slow breath. He had spent his life making high-stakes deals, controlling every outcome. But at this moment he felt completely powerless. "That drawing you gave me, how did you know? The mansion, the man, the child. How did you know?" The boy hesitated, glancing down at his worn-out shoes. "I told you, sir. I don't know. It's just something I see in my head sometimes. I don't know why." Alexander swallowed hard. His chest tightened. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. "Ethan," he finally whispered. "Do you have anywhere to go? Any family?" Ethan shook his head. "No, sir. I've been on my own for a while." Something inside Alexander snapped. Without thinking, without questioning, he made a decision that shocked even himself. "Come with me." Ethan's eyes widened. "Where, sir?" "To my house." There was no logic behind his words. No calculation. Just instinct. Just a feeling, one he couldn't shake. "I think we're connected somehow," Alexander said. And I need to know why. A truth too terrible to ignore. When Alexander brought Ethan to his mansion, the staff was stunned. Never had they seen him show kindness, let alone to a homeless child. But Alexander felt it. This wasn't charity. This wasn't guilt. It was something much, much deeper. And as days passed, it became impossible to ignore. Ethan knew things. He was drawn to certain rooms Alexander himself rarely entered. He would stop in front of old furniture, staring as if he recognized them. He would wander the halls as if retracing steps he had once taken. Then, one night, Ethan spoke words that made Alexander's blood run cold. "Sir, do you know about the boy who lived here before?" Alexander's breath caught. His heart slammed against his ribs. There hadn't been a child in this mansion for years. Not since him. "What boy?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's eyes darkened, as if staring through time itself. "The one who used to play in the gardens. He was happy here until he wasn't." Alexander's knees nearly buckled. 'Cause there had been a boy. His son. A son lost in a tragic accident. A pain so great that Alexander had buried it deep, locked it away, never speaking of it again. But Ethan knew. Somehow this child, a stranger, knew. His hands trembled as he led Ethan into the one room he had sealed shut for years. The nursery. Ethan stepped inside and smiled softly, running his small fingers along the dusty furniture. "This was his room," he whispered. "He used to sit by the window, waiting for you to come home." Alexander fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He had spent his life chasing success, believing that money could fill the void inside him. But standing there in that room, he realized the truth. He had been running from his past, running from his guilt, running from the love he had lost. And now, somehow, it had found him again. A love that never fades. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Alexander adopted Ethan, giving him the family he had never known. But it wasn't just Ethan who was saved. Alexander was saved. His mansion, once a cold, empty symbol of wealth, became a home again. Laughter filled its halls. Love replaced loneliness. And for the first time in decades, Alexander felt something he thought he had lost forever. The past had found him. But instead of haunting him, it had healed him. And in the end, it wasn't the drawing that had changed his life. It was the love he had rediscovered in a child who had unknowingly brought him back to life. Because true wealth isn't power or money. Unsettling about it, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He traced the lines of the sketch with his fingertips, his thoughts racing. How did that boy know about his mansion? And more importantly, why did the image of a young child standing beside him feel so familiar? Sleep evaded him that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the drawing flashed in his mind. He could almost hear the child's frail voice again. "Please, sir, buy my drawing. I'm very hungry." It wasn't just the hunger in the boy's voice that lingered. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The next morning, Alexander found himself doing something completely out of character. Instead of heading straight to his office, he ordered his driver to take him back to the street where he had met the boy. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the feeling in his chest told him he needed to find the child. But when he arrived at the spot, the boy was nowhere to be seen. His heart sank, a reaction that surprised him. He had spent his entire life hardening himself against emotions, against attachments. Why was this different? Determined, he stepped out of his car, scanning the streets. A few vendors and passers-by glanced at him, but no one seemed to know where the boy had gone. Just as he was about to give up, an elderly woman selling flowers nearby spoke up. "Are you looking for the little artist?" she asked, her voice kind yet weary. Alexander turned to her sharply. "Yes. Do you know him?" The woman nodded. "He comes here often, selling his drawings to buy food." Poor child has no home, no family. A strange pain twisted in Alexander's chest. Do you know where he stays? She hesitated before pointing down the street. There's an old alley a few blocks from here. He sometimes sleeps there when he has nowhere else to go. Alexander didn't waste another second. He hurried down the street, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. He wasn't sure what he was doing. Was he truly concerned about this boy, or was it just the unsettling mystery that drew him in? When he reached the alley, his breath caught in his throat. There, curled up on a tattered blanket, was the boy, fast asleep. His tiny frame shivered in the cold, his hands still clutching a few crumpled pieces of paper. Alexander crouched beside him, his gaze falling on the sketches scattered around. They weren't random drawings. They were images of his mansion again, but this time there were more details. Details that no stranger should know. And then he saw it. A new drawing, one that made his blood run cold. It was of him, standing in front of the mansion, holding hands with a young boy. But this time the child in the drawing had a face. And Alexander recognized it. His own childhood face. He staggered back, his mind reeling. How was this possible? How could this boy have drawn something from his past? Something even he had long buried in his memory. Just then the child stirred, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw Alexander, a small, sleepy smile crossed his lips. "You came back," he whispered. Alexander swallowed, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Who are you?" The boy sat up, rubbing his eyes. "I don't know, sir. But I think I know you." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was something else, something much, much deeper. And in that moment, Alexander Carter, the ruthless billionaire who had built an empire with his own hands, realized one terrifying truth. This boy wasn't just a stranger. He was a key to a past Alexander had long forgotten. And now, it was coming back.